Hi, everyone. This is Stephen Fish, the Executive Director of Canadian Business for Social Responsibility. Thank you for joining us today. I get the honor of introducing our two panelists for the day. But just first, quickly, I just wanted to say that I'm really thrilled that we were able to get this session on our agenda for this year. It was really important for us as an organization to address diversity and inclusion and kind of start questioning why it had fallen out of the corporate social responsibility spectrum and does not typically come up in a lot of discussions. And there's a very clear, not only is it the right thing to do, but there are some very clear linkages to the strength of your business and opportunities in new markets and new streams of business as well. So we thought it was important to put it on the agenda for this year, and the response has been incredible. This is really a strong showing of registrants for this particular session, so we're looking forward to it. So first, I want to introduce Cathy Gallagher-Louisy, who's the Director of Community Partnerships and Knowledge Services at the Canadian Institute for Diversity and Inclusion, which is a relatively new organization, but I'll let Cathy explain the history and some of the recent movers and shakers that's going on over there. So Cathy is an experienced diversity and inclusion professional and a certified intercultural trainer and coach with over 20 years of experience in human resources, project management roles within corporate, government, and nonprofit organizations. Cathy leads the CIDI's research portfolio and also helps partner organizations and clients develop strategic D&I and cultural competency strategies, programs, and tools. Additionally, Cathy leads the Institute's community outreach portfolio and responsible for managing the CIDI's volunteer initiatives and developing the CIDI's partnerships and charities, nonprofit, and community agencies serving different demographic groups throughout Canada. And she's joined by Cyndy Allen, the team lead consulting, respectful workplace, and diversity for Bell Aliant. She's located in Halifax, Nova Scotia, so she's joining us from Nova Scotia today, so welcome to Cyndy. Cyndy is the team lead for consulting, respectful workplace, and diversity at Bell Aliant. Over the last 15 years, Cyndy has worked in many areas of human resources, including strategy, talent, compensation, benefits, consulting, and diversity. Cyndy remains active publishing and presenting at various conferences across North America and is on the board of a local children's not-for-profit organization. So with that introduction, I'd like to turn things over to Cathy. And just briefly before I do that, we'd love to take your questions. If you could use the chat feature on the WebEx to submit your questions, we'll consolidate them and submit those questions for consideration for our two panelists at the end of the call. And we will have the line muted, so if you need to get through to us, it's best to use the chat feature in WebEx. And then again, we will open up the lines for Q&A at the end of the call. So over to you, Cathy.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I very much appreciate this opportunity to partner with CBSR. We've been talking about it for some time, so it's great to finally make it happen. Quick about our agenda for today. First, we're going to talk a little bit about CBSR and CIDI, just so that for those of you who may be in one of our networks or the other, you can learn a little bit more about each organization. We're going to take a moment to define diversity and inclusion and talk about what does diversity have to do with CSR. Then a little bit on the business case for why organizations should be focused on managing diversity and inclusion. Then Cyndy will share the Bell Aliant diversity story. And then we'll share a little bit of information going farther into measurement on how Canadian organizations are measuring diversity and inclusion, where we'll share some results from a study that we did last year on measurement practices in Canadian organizations. Just so that I can sort of ground this conversation, for ease of reference, I'm going to be referring to some very big buckets of practice in short form. So when I say social responsibility or corporate social responsibility, CSR, I'm referring to the broad realm of corporate social responsibility and sustainability and everything that includes. And in referring to diversity, inclusion, equity, human rights, anti-racism, and anti-oppressive practice, which is a very big realm, again, I'm going to refer to that as diversity or diversity and inclusion, but I want to make sure that you're aware that I'm trying to be inclusive of all of these different areas just without having to say a giant mouthful every time I refer to it. Also, I wanted to say this will be a very introductory look at the linkages and synergies between CSR and D&I. For those of you who are very familiar with the diversity realm, some of the information might be a bit basic. For those of you who are very familiar with the CSR realm, again, some of the information might be a bit basic, but I'm hoping that you'll learn more about the other realm that you might not be as familiar with, and that we'll have an opportunity to really highlight those linkages and synergies. And one thing I wanted to point out about my presentation, which you might find odd, people often ask about this, is the punctuation all over the place. You'll notice at the end of every title, at the end of every bullet point, there will be some sort of punctuation, a period or a semicolon or colon. And that is something that we are trying to model as an accessibility feature in documents. And so as an organization that's dedicated to diversity, we're trying to do our utmost to make sure that everything that we do is accessible. And so when you send a document to a person who has a visual impairment, if they're using a screen reader, the screen reader actually cannot see formatting or bullet points or spaces or even page breaks. So what the main way to let the screen reader know that you're at the end of a point or a title or the end of an important spot is to put punctuation at the end of everything. So it's something we're trying to model, and just wanted to highlight that in case you think it looks weird on our presentation. And now I'm going to hand it back over to Stephen and Stephanie here to tell you a little bit about CBSR.
Yeah, I mean, very briefly, we're in our 19th year of existence, started out in very early days of CSR. We're a membership-based organization, so all of our revenue comes from our members' contributions to us, which we thank them for, of course. We are a not-for-profit in mission, but we also have a charitable foundation as well. We drive a lot of our educational work through. Yeah, so I don't want to take up too much time, but I mean, we've been around a long time in the CSR space. I think that the culture of CSR is changing and evolving. It's becoming much more strategic and holistic, and so I think you see that reflected in some of the themes and some of the topics that we're exploring this year. And diversity and inclusion was something that we had prioritized. So just happy to have you here again.
Thanks. Thanks. And a little bit about the CIDI. Interestingly, we have a very similar operating model to CBSR, but we have not been around for 19 years. We have not even been around for 19 months. We officially had our anniversary on March 1st. It was March 1st of last year when we got our formal nonprofit status from the CRA. Unofficially, we got started in November of 2012. So we've had just an amazing year of growth, and it's been very exciting to see that people really are valuing the kind of services that we're providing. We are also a nonprofit organization. We also have a charitable arm that does education, and we're also member supported. We also do consulting as well. And like CBSR, we're unique in Canada. There's no other organization like us throughout Canada. So it's great to kind of see the momentum happening of the support. So we do also thank our employer partners, our members who support us, and everyone who comes out to all our events and contributes. I would also like to thank our 85 volunteers and 10 interns who contribute quite a lot to all of the things that we do, so thank you. And we'll move on to the presentation now. So first we're going to take a moment to really just define what is diversity and inclusion for people. I think one of the challenges is that a lot of people, when you hear the word diversity, you think about ethnicity. And so we want to really broaden the definition and make sure that we're inclusive of all the different areas of difference. So what is diversity? This is the dictionary definition. Essentially, it's the state or fact of being diverse, different, unlikeness, multiformity, variety, a point of difference. Inclusion is the act of including, in the state of being included. So if you're going to talk about diversity and inclusion broadly, diversity is about difference. Inclusion is about including, and so diversity and inclusion is about including difference, and that covers all kinds of difference. And so we really want to, ethnicity and race is a really important part, culture is a really important part, but we want to broaden the definition much further. Another way to think about it is diversity has sometimes been about counting people, sometimes in employment equity or affirmative action or various types of initiatives that have happened in the past. Inclusion is about making people count. Another way of putting it is my former boss, Andreas Tapia, he put it this way: diversity is the mix, and inclusion is making the mix work. And so that encompasses whatever mix of people you have in your organization. So this is another piece to think about. These are some of the dimensions of diversity. So again, as I mentioned, most people when they think about diversity, they think about ethnicity, but we really need to think about many, many different dimensions here: gender, race, ethnicity, culture, indigenous peoples, ability, sexual orientation, age, socioeconomic status, and there's many more we could add to this list, but I didn't want to make the slide too long. The thing to think about is, even if you're in an organization that doesn't have much ethnic diversity, you still have diversity. We have 4 generations working in the workplace. We have people of different socioeconomic status, people with different backgrounds and worldviews, people with different religions, that should be on there, people with different abilities and sexual orientation. So you definitely have diversity in your organization, regardless of whether you have an ethnic mix in your organization. So that's something to keep in mind for all organizations. We often hear from organizations, oh, we don't have diversity, so we don't really have to deal with this. But certainly everyone does. And so I'd like to go on to the next slide talking about some of the ways that diversity is referred to in different organizations. So many organizations refer to it as diversity and inclusion. That's often talked about definitely in the for-profit world, but a lot of organizations are referring to it as diversity and inclusion now. Equity and human rights is widely used in the public sector as a way of approaching the broad set of issues and initiatives that go with diversity and inclusion. Equality is used widely. In the UK, for example, the UK Equality Act of 2010 is kind of the benchmark there for managing these issues, and so that's the kind of framework. Accessibility is a huge piece for many organizations and might be the way through which an organization comes to this conversation. Anti-racism is an important piece of it as well and may be the main focus for some organizations. And anti-oppressive practice is used quite frequently and widely in the social services sector, really looking at the diversity in the people that they're serving to make sure that they're being cognizant of being culturally competent and being aware of some of the challenges that encompass providing social services to a diverse group. So there's a lot of different terminology around this. I'm going to refer to the whole bucket as diversity and inclusion, but I'm trying to make it clear that when I refer to diversity or diversity and inclusion, I'm referring to all these different approaches. The interesting thing about it is all of them really encompass the same thing. How is your organization dealing with difference, and how are you approaching making sure that there are no barriers to inclusion for anybody within your employment space or within the people that you serve in your market as well. And so that's, it's a broad space of how you approach difference. And the verbiage is very important. So I'd like to point out this. I would love to see the word tolerance go away forever. I cannot tolerate the word tolerance. Tolerance means I will put up with you, but I won't like it. I tolerate going to the dentist. I don't really feel all warm and fuzzy when my husband says, "Dear, I tolerate you so much." Inclusion means I value you and you are accepted and respected and that you are part of the group. Inclusion means you are as welcome as me. So we really need to reframe this word, move toward inclusion, stop using the word tolerance. Tolerance is not a good thing. Tolerance is I'm putting up with you. So it's important that we, if you see people using the word tolerance, remind them of this. Please don't use the word tolerance yourself. We're trying to move far beyond tolerance at this point in time. Also, in terms of verbiage, I like to talk about equality versus equity. So a lot of people are moving into more talking about equity versus equality. In some cases, people talk about equality as treating everybody exactly the same, but in some cases, being fair is not necessarily treating everyone exactly the same. So if you click on the next slide, equality is giving everyone a shoe. If you give everyone a size 10 shoe, you've treated them all equally. It's not going to fit most people, though. So equity is giving everyone a shoe that fits. I really like this way of putting it because it's simple, and I don't intend to simplify it too much, but it's the point that sometimes equity means doing what's appropriate for different groups of people as opposed to treating everybody exactly the same. And we just need to be very sensitive to when it's appropriate to do that. So what does diversity have to do with CSR? If we go to the next slide, the 5 pillars of CSR, most people would recognize these, and probably this same slide has been used repeatedly in CSR presentations across the land. We have environment, ethics and governance, employees, human rights, and community. Certainly, it's fairly obvious that diversity is quite an important part and very impactful on human rights and employees. But I think you can argue also that diversity is an important part of the community. If you look at the makeup of the different communities in which you operate, you're definitely going to see diversity there. Also, it's an important part of ethics and governance and looking at making sure that your board is reflective of the population you're serving. It's a huge issue right now, for diversity on boards, and we have a long way to go in a number of areas here. So that's an important part of diversity as well. But I think you can also make an argument for the environment. If you think about the impacts of climate change, it tends to be the third world countries, the poor countries that are experiencing the greatest impact soonest of some of the environmental issues. And so diversity is, you can see, an important part of all the pillars of CSR. But to make it more formal, I want to refer to one of the most formal methods of measuring CSR, the GRI. So what's the GRI? So the GRI is the Global Reporting Initiative, and it essentially, the GRI, the Global Reporting Initiative, is a nonprofit organization that promotes economic sustainability. They've created a set of reporting standards, which is currently the world's most widely used sustainability reporting framework. It's also known as ecological footprint reporting, environmental, social, and governance reporting, triple bottom line reporting, and CSR reporting. So the GRI is hoping to make sustainability reporting, or GRI reporting, as routine and normal for all kinds of organizations as the standard audited financial reports are now. It's being used around the world by over 4,000 organizations. And so the most recent version of the GRI, the G4, was released last year. And interestingly, it actually increased the number of measures on diversity and inclusion and human rights. So in the G3, there were 13 indicators that were specifically related to diversity, inclusion, and human rights as we would consider it in terms of impacting the workplace. And on the G4, there's 18 indicators. So we're going to go through those indicators very briefly, not spending a lot of time on them, but just so that we can point them out to you. So they break down the reporting into different aspects. Under labor practices and decent work, you've got the aspect on employment. So this indicator asks organizations to report on the total number and rates of new employee hires and employee turnover by age group, gender, and region. The next indicator asks to report on the return to work and retention rates after parental leave by gender. The next one, the aspect is occupational health and safety, and it's asking organizations to report on the type of injury and rates of injury, occupational diseases, lost days and absenteeism, and total number of work-related fatalities by region and by gender. Again, I've highlighted the things in these descriptions that are specifically pulling out the diversity aspect of the indicator. Under labor practices and decent work, again, we have training and education as an aspect, and they've asked for an indication of the average hours of training per year by employee, per employee by gender and by employee category. The next one is the percentage of employees receiving regular performance and career development reviews by gender and by employee category. And you can see the GRI is aware that there might be differences by gender, and it's important that organizations report on these. The next piece is very specifically about diversity, and it's called diversity and equal opportunity. The indicator asks organizations to report on the composition of governance bodies and the breakdown of employees per employee category by gender, age group, minority group membership, and other indicators of diversity. So they're essentially asking you to report out the demographics of your workforce in full. And a lot of Canadian organizations aren't even measuring a lot of these things. So we'll get to that later. Next piece. Again, looking at equal remuneration, I always stumble over that particular word. So basically the ratio of salary, and I'll try not to say that again, of women to men by employee category, by significant locations and operation. And so you look at, again, they're aware that there may be differences by men and women, and that it's important for organizations to be transparent about that, and also to indicate what they're doing to try and mitigate and correct those imbalances. Moving on to the next section of the GRI, it's around human rights. And so this aspect is looking at the percentage and total number of significant investment agreements and contracts that include clauses incorporating human rights concerns or that have undergone human rights screening. The next one, also under human rights, talks about the total hours of employee training on human rights policies and procedures. The next one, also under human rights, talks about non-discrimination. And so it's looking at the total number of incidents of discrimination and corrective actions taken. And you might think that that's not a really big issue for Canadian organizations, but it really is. There's lots of organizations who track their harassment and discrimination complaints internally, and we see lots and lots of complaints getting up to human rights tribunals in different provinces, and some quite stringent results coming out of those. And that's part of the aspect of the cost of not managing diversity. Moving on to the next one is security practices, and it's looking at the percentage of security personnel trained in human rights policies and procedures. So that's an interesting approach as well, making sure that if you have security personnel, that they're aware of human rights, and you can also, if you want to go a step further, include making sure that security personnel and all employees are trained in diversity as well. The next one under human rights is around Indigenous rights. So it's the total number of incidents and violations involving rights of Indigenous people and actions taken. Again, the whole point of the GRI is to encourage organizations to be transparent about these issues that they're dealing with. So they're asking for a lot of really, quite extensive reporting in this area. The next one's on human rights assessment, the number and percentage of operations that have been subject to human rights reviews or impact assessments. Then the next one's on grievance mechanisms, the number of grievances related to human rights filed, addressed, and resolved. The next one is on society. So there's another section of the GRI talking about society. We've covered labor practices, human rights. This part's on society. And this one is looking at the impacts on communities. So the percentage of operations with implemented local community engagement, impact assessments, and development programs. And you can see that depending on the communities you're dealing with, you're going to be dealing with different aspects of diversity there that you really should be cognizant of. The next one is on operations with significant potential or actual negative impacts on local communities. A slightly different way of putting it. Under compliance, the next one is the monetary value of significant fines and total number of non-monetary sanctions for noncompliance with laws and regulations. There are a lot of laws and regulations that are related to diversity and inclusion that Canadian organizations need to be paying attention to. So that's an important part of their reporting. And then finally, under society, the grievance mechanisms for impacts on society. Again, looking at the number of grievances about impacts on society filed, addressed, and resolved through the formal grievance mechanisms. So you can see there, based on the most widely recognized standard on what it means for an organization to do corporate social responsibility. I mean, if an organization says they're doing CSR, they should be doing GRI reporting. The GRI report requires 18 indicators that specifically relate to diversity and human rights. Under the human rights section of the GRI, there's a number of other indicators that get into child labor practices and anti-corruption practices, which we're not covering it today because we're more focused on diversity and inclusion in Canadian workplaces. However, that would be very impactful for any Canadian organization that has operations in other countries. So really, you should pay attention to those aspects of the GRI to make sure that you're being quite transparent about all of your diversity and human rights initiatives. So that's a real quick overview of a very, very deep document. The GRI website has a lot more information, and including guidelines, how to report, and under each of those aspects, there's specific questions that they ask you to fill out. So under each of those very high-level definitions, there's a number of things that they're asking you specifically for specific data points if you're going to be reporting on this. So moving now into the business case. Why should organizations be focusing more on managing diversity and inclusion? So I could have put many, many, many pieces of information here, but I tried to just pull out a few in the interest of time. Certainly, Canada has rapidly changing demographics. Anyone who's not aware of this is probably hiding under a rock somewhere. But we know that the demographics are changing right across Canada in all of our major cities and towns. We have the highest rate of immigration of any of the G20 countries, with approximately 250,000 people arriving every year. According to the 2011 census, more than 20% of Canadians were born outside Canada. When you look at some of Canada's biggest cities, like Toronto, for example, that's more than 50% in Toronto are people that were not born in Canada. When you look at the Aboriginal population, it is the fastest growing population in Canada. And the most recent census shows that there's 1.4 million Aboriginal people in Canada, so that's a really big piece. I know a lot of organizations who do corporate social responsibility are focusing on Aboriginal in terms of land and community involvement and making sure that their operations are not impacting the Aboriginal community. But it's also an important part of your internal processes as well, your human resources process, and making sure that your organization is inclusive for Aboriginal peoples. And if you think about the impending talent crunch, it is the fastest growing demographic, so there's great opportunity there. The next slide I want to look at is, apologize for the lot of information here, but what I really wanted to highlight is the financial influence of all the different major demographic groups that we often talk about in terms of diversity. Some of these stats are a couple of years old, and so I'd like to find new ones, but you get the idea. So the point there is that some of the numbers may actually be higher now. Women, and I would like to point out at the end of the presentation, there's references for all of these stats. Women account for 50% of the Canadian, almost 50% of the Canadian workforce, and make up 90% of day-to-day household financial decisions. The visible minority population in Canada has a spending power of over $76 billion. People with disabilities have a spending power of over $25 billion, but the important thing to note here is that every person with a disability has a family and a network. And so if they're treated badly by any particular business, they're going to tell their family and their network, and their family and their network are likely to avoid that business as well. They're also early adopters of technology. It's interesting to note that 72% of people with disabilities are likely to upgrade to the latest model of a product. So that's an interesting thing to keep in mind when you're looking at marketing. Aboriginal peoples, there are over 10,000 businesses owned by Aboriginal people in Canada, and the spending power of the Aboriginal community is over $24 billion. And then the LGBT community has a spending power of nearly $100 billion, and then a really important piece here is they're a very loyal customer segment to think about from your organizational, whatever you're marketing. 74% of LGBT adults are likely to consider brands that support nonprofits and causes that are important to them. So that's they have this particular demographic group has very, very strong brand loyalty, and also very strong, in terms of boycotting brands that are, anti-LGBT in any way. So that's a very important piece to keep in mind. Normally, I would spend a great deal of time talking more detail on each of these different groups, but in the interest of time, I do want to make sure that we have time for questions at the end. I'd like to just highlight one group. So let's look at the case of women. So here's a little quiz, and we're going to pull up a poll, right? Okay. So in what school year do women start to account for more than 50% of undergraduate degrees? And we're just loading the poll up right now. So please take a moment to vote, and we'll see how the results come in.
Exciting. There we go. It's up on the screen now.
Okay, great. Results are coming in. Thank you for voting.
We're just going to pause for 1 minute to bring in as many responses to the poll as possible. So you've got another, looks like one full minute from now.
Okay, great.
Just remind everyone on the phone that if you do have some questions, please feel free to use the chat feature within the Cisco WebEx technology, and we'll address those questions after Cathy and Cyndy have spoken.
Great. We'll also open up the phone lines at the end.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I mean, if you're not interested, if you want to,
you don't want to type out your
question, you can chat voice to voice.
How are we doing on the poll there? Most responses in?
Yep.
Good.
Just give them maybe 10 or 20 more seconds.
Okay. Yeah, we still see a few people are voting. Thank you.
Yeah, it'll time out in just a little
20
over, just 20 seconds. Yeah. We haven't used the polling feature before, so we're very excited. Thank you for. Oh, sorry, that tells me. Yeah. New to me.
That's one of the things about webinars. We have to try and use the technology in ways to make it more interactive for people.
Yeah, this is great.
And here's the results of the poll.
Yep, it's just 5 more seconds. Let it load.
So in what school year did women start to account for more than 50% of undergraduate degrees?
So most of the participants have agreed that it was 1989 to 1990, but what is
the actual answer? Can we advance the screen? 1979 to 1980. So 24% of you were right. The reason why we bring this up is because, with women being the majority of undergraduate degrees for 34 years now, we would hope to see more advancement of women and more parity of women in the workforce. But here's the actual situation. Women in Canadian business. This information was just released by Catalyst this week, 3 days ago, and it shows they do a pyramid every year showing the representation of women in Canadian business. So you can see here that while women are 47% of the Canadian workforce, that they are only 6.9% of top earners and 5.1% of CEOs. And interestingly, that has gone down since last year. So I had the pyramid on my PowerPoint that I do this kind of information on a regular basis, and sadly, the CEOs have gone down. So there are some challenges. One thing that's interesting to note is also on board representation. The board representation, there's been a lot of work trying to increase the representation of women on corporate boards, but the pace of change is very, very slow. And in fact, another report that was just released by Catalyst this week shows that 42% of Canada's biggest listed companies have no female directors at all. And this, despite the fact that there was a Catalyst study that was put out a couple of years ago that says that Fortune 500 companies with 3 or more women on their boards gain significant financial advantage over companies without women on their boards. This includes an increased 73% return on sales, 83% return on equity, and 112% return on invested capital. And yet here's still 42% of organizations with no women on their boards whatsoever. So clearly there's a long way to go to improve. The good news is women will eventually achieve parity in Canada. However, according to a study that came out last year, it's going to take us 228 years to get there if we continue at the current pace of change. This study came out from the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives last year. And so it took into account a number of issues, women on boards, women in senior leadership positions, and also pay equity. So clearly, if it's going to take 228 years to get there, if we continue at the current rate of change, we really need to do a lot to accelerate the pace of change. The next piece we're going to talk a little more around, it lends itself to the business case, but it talks about why focus on managing diversity. I love this slide here. It was originally shared with us in a presentation at Hewitt Associates from Dr. Milton Bennett, but it really makes the case quite nicely that multicultural teams are not more effective than monocultural teams. In fact, they can be less effective, and the main differentiator is how the leader manages a difference. So if the leader ignores or suppresses differences, then those differences become an obstacle to performance. If the leader acknowledges and supports the differences, then the differences become an asset to performances. So it's really important to note that we all have difference in our teams. We all have diversity. We all have multiple cultures. And so if we're not managing it, we can actually be creating an incredible detriment to our organization. Some of the bottom line impacts around managing diversity, increasing revenues. So embracing diversity can help increase revenues by attracting new customers and finding new markets, building customer loyalty, retaining existing business, expanding your global growth strategy, and improving success in cross-cultural negotiations. The next piece of bottom line impact talks about reducing costs. So fostering a diverse and inclusive environment can help your company reduce costs by eliminating differential turnover across demographic groups. There's a lot of evidence that shows that people will leave an organization if they're not finding that it's inclusive, and we know that turnover is quite a large cost to our organization. Controlling your relocation costs and minimizing litigation costs. If you're not managing things well, you may be going up into having discrimination complaints or human rights complaints. Just even having to deal with one of those complaints, if it becomes a formal process, is quite expensive. You have to get lawyers involved. And then there's a high likelihood that when it does get to the tribunal, you're going to be assessed with fines and other penalties. Another bottom line impact on managing diversity is recruiting and retaining the top talent, which is a really important issue for all organizations right now, especially as we're leading into a talent crunch, as so many people are in the process of retiring. Some of the estimations on the Canadian market is that we're going to have a shortfall of between 800,000 and 1 million jobs. I mean, so many people are leaving the workforce that there are not enough people to fill those positions. So that there's going to be a massive war for talent when that happens. And making sure that you have an inclusive workforce is a good way to attract top talent. Maximizing productivity through providing increased flexibility in how people work, and also maximizing employee engagement. There's a great deal of evidence that shows that engaged employees are more productive, they provide better customer service, they go above and beyond more regularly, and they experience less absenteeism, which is also a cost. But overall, it's a great impact to your organization if you can increase employee engagement, and a lot of organizations have done some great work in linking employee engagement with inclusion. So now that's a lot of information about why you should be paying attention to diversity and how diversity links with corporate social responsibility. So thank you for bearing with us through all of that. I'd like to turn the phone over right now to Cyndy Allen from Bell Aliant, and she's going to share a real-life example of a Canadian company focused on diversity within CSR. What I really love about what Cyndy's going to talk about is how they really bring to life diversity through the experiences of their employees. Cyndy?
Thanks so much, Cathy. Hello, everyone. Before we get started, I thought that I would tell you a bit about Bell Aliant for those of you who haven't heard of us. Stephanie, if I can get you to go to the next slide. We are a communications company that came together in 2006, and we serve customers across 6 provinces all the way to the Manitoba border. And we we deal in the communications and technology and video and TV realms. We have close to 7,000 employees, and we are heavily unionized. And this has a real impact on our approach to diversity and inclusion. So on to the next slide, Stephanie. So when I think about Bell Aliant, we have spent a lot of time and effort including diversity as part of our corporate social responsibility. And through years, we fine-tuned our objective to foster an inclusive work environment, including increasing cultural awareness, leading to more respectful and inclusive behaviors. So that's our lofty goal. And what we've done is we've tried to make this very accessible to employees. And Stephanie, if you can go on to the next slide. What we've done is we've actually created a Bell Aliant Diversity Committee that is a group of both unionized and management employees. And we've tried to create a place of communication coming from the first person. So we spend a lot of time creating employee stories every month of employees that have personally been part of things like Black History Month, International Day for Persons with Disabilities, World Mental Health Day, International Day Against Homophobia, Aboriginal Day, Asian Heritage Month, etc. And I've put on this slide one of the pictures that we included in our recent posting on Black History Month, where we had one of our employees. Her name's Bernice Arsenault. She was a building maintenance technician, and she told the story of how Black History Month has impacted her. She was a little girl. She's third from the left in this picture, the Canada Post stamp that was just launched in February, celebrating Africville, one of our Black communities here in Halifax. So we've tried to make diversity very accessible to our employees, and have continued with a communication strategy that involves basically a communication going out once every 6 to 8 weeks, and this has been ongoing for in excess of 5 years. The other thing that we recently have done in the diversity space, and if I can get you to go on, Stephanie, we spent a lot of time thinking about how we could make our employee population more diverse. And we are a company that has experienced a lot of change, downsizing through the last 5 years. And through that, we knew that our diversity numbers would be impacted. So we have refocused now in 2013-2014 on our recruitment strategies and looking at ways to ensure that we have more diverse candidates applying for our roles. So we are doing our recruiting and our advertising differently now, as well as we've spent a lot of time talking to leaders about how to be inclusive and educating them on the benefits of why they would want a more diverse employee population. I think we still have a ways to go on this front, but there is a concerted effort and a focus by the organization to continue on. So that is the Bell Aliant story and what we've been doing the last couple of years.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you. It's great to share stories of organizations that are doing great work in this area. One of the beauties of being able to share these kind of best practices and success stories is to let other organizations know that it's very possible to do well in this area. So thank you for sharing. I really love the way you take the time to include employees in your communications and make the stories come alive, that they're not just this ethereal, abstract thing, but it's actually real, and it impacts their coworkers. So it helps to make the whole issue more real for people, and that's a great way of approaching it. Thank you very much for sharing your information. And now we're going to talk a little bit about a study that we completed last year. There's a link there to the full report. It's on our website. And it's under, if you're going to the main page of our website, it's under What We Do and under Think Tank. Our research reports there. This one is called What Gets Measured Gets Done, Measuring the Return on Investment of Diversity and Inclusion. And it happens to be the only report on measurement practices in Canadian organizations for diversity and inclusion. So the research came about through a request from one of our employer partners, and we embarked on developing a diversity scorecard for them. And the first step was to do some benchmarking around what was already being done in Canada. And so we did a literature review. At that point, we found there was no Canadian literature. We did also an online survey where we got responses from 56 Canadian organizations from all different sectors, all different sizes and right across Canada, so it was great to see diversity of respondents. We also did a website review where we looked at the websites of every employer on the Best Diversity Employers list for Canada to see what they were reporting on in terms of how they're measuring. What we found is most of them aren't even mentioning their measurement practices at all, with the exception of organizations that are doing GRI reporting. So there's the linkage again. And the final stage of the research was 19 interviews with diversity leaders across Canada. We compiled all of that into this final report that summarizes the practices that we found. And at the end of the report, there's a toolkit for either implementing or improving your diversity metrics. So please feel free to take a look at that. One of the things that we're trying to, one of our mantras is we want to provide practical tools for people. As my boss likes to say, we are tired of admiring the problem. We are engaging people in developing the solutions. So I'm going to just share some highlights from our report. One of the things we found that was really interesting is 79.6% of the organizations that we surveyed said that diversity and inclusion, or equity and human rights, that's the way we phrase the question, is a strategic priority within their organizations. This is great, right? Well, we would hope to see 100%, but 80% is pretty good, right? Okay, so then the next thing we asked was, are you measuring the efficacy, impact, or ROI of your diversity, inclusiveness, equity, or human rights initiatives? And the result was not exactly. So we had 80% saying it's a strategic priority, but then we have less than 20% measuring it. So then we go, how many other strategic initiatives does your organization not measure? You know, if something is truly a strategic priority, you're usually going to have some metrics placed around it. So, you know, we recognize there's a pretty big gap between, I guess, what we want to say, people's intention and what they're actually doing. The next piece we asked is, does your organization have a diversity scorecard or robust reporting framework? Because we know that not everybody uses the term scorecard. So it could be a dashboard, it could be whatever you call it in your organization. We found that only 12.5% actually were using a diversity scorecard. So again, this is a problem. We know that what gets measured gets done. And we also know that when it comes time to cut or downsize, we see over and over again that CSR and diversity and inclusion people are getting cut out of organizations. And we feel that one of the challenges is because, you know, first of all, we know we're all under-resourced in doing this work in organizations. But second of all, if we're not taking the time to measure and show the impact of what we're doing to our organizational leaders, then when it comes time for them to cut, they're going to go, well, let's cut something that's not showing value. So if you haven't taken the time to show the value of what you're doing, they're not going to be aware of the value. So what was interesting is when we asked the organizations that do have a diversity scorecard or dashboard, what was the results of using it, we found this. 100% of those using a diversity scorecard said that it had raised the profile of their D&I initiatives among their organization's top leadership, and 100% said that it had become part of the organization's overall strategic reporting or scorecard. It's hard to argue with 100%. So this really shows the value of why you should be measuring. The next slide talks about some of the standard measures of inclusion. So what we're looking at is representation of diverse or underrepresented groups by job level, or every demographic by job level, recruitment, promotion, and turnover statistics by demographic group, employee engagement scores by demographic group, diversity-related or inclusiveness questions on employee surveys by demographic group. You'll see a trend here. You really need to understand the demographics of your organization in order to do some of these standard measures. One of the shocking things we found is that when we asked organizations what they were measuring, we found only 52% were actually even asking demographic questions of their employees. So that's, 48% don't even have this basic information, so they can't necessarily even do these kinds of measures of inclusion. Going on to some other standard measures, tracking human rights, harassment, and discrimination complaints, participation in training on diversity and inclusiveness, and participation in employee resource groups or employee networking groups, which are becoming quite common in a lot of organizations. Going beyond the standard metrics, we found some organizations were going into leading indicators versus lagging indicators. So lagging indicators are measures of what has already happened in an organization, like turnover, lawsuits, complaints. Leading indicators predict what will happen with an employee's experience, and those are more important than lagging indicators when measuring diversity and inclusion work. Some of the leading indicators might include whether the employee has a mentor or executive sponsor, which employees are working on high-profile projects and clients, these kinds of things. And then what some of the leading organizations that are doing more advanced reporting here, they are correlating those pieces of information with demographics to make sure that it's actually impacting their representation goals. Who is accountable for diversity and inclusion in your organization? This is an interesting case. So we found a wide range of practices here. In many organizations, nobody was accountable for it, except for perhaps the one person who had it on their plate in the HR department. But we found some good, better, and best practices, of course. So a good practice is if you have some performance metrics for your senior leaders that are related to diversity and inclusion. Better practice is if you have all people managers. We didn't find that too often. And then the best practice we found was in a national telecommunications company in Canada where all employees had some performance metric on their annual performance report that was related to diversity and inclusion. Of course, we know what gets measured gets done. So if you really value something, you also know this from the CBSR realm, if it's very valued, then you need to be measuring people on making that part of their accountability. The next piece is just going to sort of highlight some of the successful diversity scorecards. What makes a successful diversity scorecard or set of metrics? First, it has to be owned by the most senior leaders. You can't have, some people in diversity or in HR or in some separate department come up with a bunch of metrics and go to the senior leaders and say, we're going to measure you on this now. They have to be involved in creating the metrics and owning them. The top leader should be accountable if it's going to be highly successful. And the top leader holds their leadership teams accountable as well, and that's part of going into making sure it's part of performance metrics. Leaders being involved in developing the scorecard is an important piece of making it successful, that the results are relevant to your organization's overall strategic goals. Can't stress this enough. Every way that you possibly can, you need to show how diversity impacts your organization's overall strategic goals, and that will provide a lot more credibility and importance in your organization. And that the organization is ready. This is an important piece. And we had some conversations with some consultants who have worked with many organizations on diversity and inclusion. And sometimes implementing too strong measures too soon might not go over well, especially if you try to implement accountability right at the beginning of implementing a diversity strategy for the first time. You can start measuring a number of things, but if you start holding people accountable for something that they've never been accountable for before, and which there are a lot of things that are influencing your performance there, it might be better to start on a diversity strategy, start doing some metrics, and add accountability in year 2 or 3. And it's just making sure that people are aware of what it is that they're accountable for and how they can impact it. And that leads to our next slide. Also, successful diversity scorecards, a wide range of data is available. We talked to one large provincial public sector organization, and they had just absolutely mouth-wateringly incredible range of metrics on all of their employee experiences going back 30 years. So when they found that something happened, they could actually look at it and see, is this an isolated incident or is it a trend? And if it's a trend, it's something we need to manage, right? They actually had just a fantastic amount of data available. The company, this particular organization, has incredible loyalty amongst their employees and a lot of really advanced diversity and work-life balance initiatives. And they have only a 2% turnover rate, so that tells you how loyal their employees are. Also, for successful diversity scorecards, that the leadership teams regularly review and understand the scorecard. And so, for those organizations who said that diversity metrics had become part of their overall operational reporting for their organization, the leaders are regularly reviewing that. And as well, that leadership and management understand how they personally can impact the metrics that are part of your diversity scorecard. That the results are communicated effectively in consistency. Again, it's no good to measure if nobody knows what the measurements are and you're not communicating it out to why you're measuring and what's the impact. And that the measures demonstrate efficacy and impact. I can't stress this enough. We see so often on people's diversity reports that they'll report 450 people took training. Great. 750 people attended lunch and learns across the country. Excellent. But what was the impact of that? That's just numbers and activities. So the most important thing you can do when you're doing those kinds of initiatives is have some, pre-surveys and post-surveys to actually show that there was some impact to that training or those lunch and learns or any kind of initiative that you're doing. As much as possible, you want to show impact, not just the fact that the activities are happening. So that's kind of a high-level overview of the whole report that we did on diversity metrics. There's a lot more information on our website if you want to download the report. And that kind of concludes my presentation. We'd be very happy to take questions right now. So is there a bunch of questions already queued up?
So I think we should give the attendees a few minutes.
Okay. If you want to ask a question, please feel free to type into the chat window. Are we going to unmute lines, or are you going to type them?
Yeah, we can unmute the lines in a minute or two. Okay. Just ask folks if you've got a jackhammer or an airplane flying by, if you wouldn't mind muting your line when you're not asking a question, that would be helpful. And we'll triage some questions here from Toronto. Maybe I could start things off with a quick question for you, Cathy. So there is a toolkit on your website, which is great. I'm just wondering, are there any other toolkits, or we talked a lot about GRI indicators, which is really kind of a big business framework for the most part. It's much larger businesses and publicly traded companies that tend to use GRI. Is there anything in the benefit corporation category, the B corporations, or are there any toolkits that are more geared towards small, medium business, for example, that might be helpful for them?
For measurement? I would say the toolkit that we put out actually has, could be used for any size business.
Right.
So it has a lot of great tips and techniques for if you have never measured diversity in your organization before, how to start, how to go for some of the low-hanging fruit, the things that are easy to measure, and how to sort of make a plan to start measuring more. If your organization has already done some types of measurements, how to improve those measures. But I'm not aware of anything else in the Canadian workplace on specifically diversity measurements for small businesses. Another toolkit we put out recently is the toolkit for creating a diversity business case, which we just released January 21st. And it was based on input from over 150 people across Canada who participated in our events in the fall, who all brainstormed on what should be in a diversity business case. We took all of that feedback and consolidated it down into one toolkit with resources. So for each section where it says you should include this in your business case, then we provided a link to how to do this, right? So how to do a SWOT analysis, how to do, an environmental scan or a market analysis, these kinds of things. The next piece we're going to be putting out is a toolkit on how to create a diversity strategy, which is based on the input that we've received from the last round of events we did in January and early February, where we engaged participants. And that was about 180 people in 6 cities across Canada who all participated in contributing to developing a diversity strategy. So we'll be consolidating all that down and putting out a new report. And it's one of the things that we try and do as much as possible is, not just provide a summary of research, but then what do you do with that information, and making it very practical and implementable for people, no matter what kind or size of organization they're in. Do we have questions coming up?
Yes, we do. Okay, so there's one from Celeste. Let me just scroll back up. It's, can you share your practices for retaining diversity employees, especially in a downsizing environment?
I think it's thank you for the question. It's a great question. I think it's really important to stress inclusion for everyone. And I know it's challenging when you're downsizing, especially, one of the challenges of diversity is often housed in the HR department. It needs to be much broader. But certainly from an HR perspective, when you're downsizing, the HR team is, very tied up with downsizing, unfortunately. And so it's there's a number of things that you can do to show employees that they're important, to make sure that everyone feels included, and that it's important to, not be cutting all the things that make your workforce an engaging workplace, right? And it's one of the things that often happens in many organizations. We've seen it over and over again. When they're trying to cut costs, they're not only downsizing the staff, but they're downsizing all the programs and initiatives that make it an engaging workplace. So you have, just this spiraling effect of people becoming less and less happy to be there, right? So it's important that you're really focused on employee engagement, and that you're focused on employee engagement initiatives for many different types of people in your workforce, and explain to them that they are important.
Hey, Cathy, it's Cyndy. The only thing that I would add on to that is you can also have a planned communication strategy to continue to communicate during a downsizing period that diversity is important. We've continued through quite heavy downsizing to reinforce to our employee population that this is a priority, and this is something that we will continue to do.
Thank you, Cyndy. I know that you've gone through quite a lot of downsizing recently, and again, it's great to see an example of an organization that's keeping that the importance of diversity front and center, even though you're going through downsizing.
Just an open question for either you or Cyndy to address. On kind of the counter to that is when you're trying to attract top diverse talent, how do you go beyond the traditional, we're a fair, equitable employer and we'll provide opportunities for everyone, kind of standard canned language? How do you position yourself and how do you communicate clearly that you've made a fundamental commitment to diversity and inclusion within your organization so that the candidates resonate with that when they're reading the job description or they're reading About Us? I'm just wondering what strategies or what you've seen that's been successful for communicating that commitment.
I think sharing as much about what you're doing around diversity and inclusion on your public website as possible, and how you're measuring it. I mean, when we looked at the websites of the top 50 diversity employers in Canada, it was amazing how few of them, they might have a little blurb about diversity, they might have some information about the diversity employee networks, which is an important piece of it, certainly, but very few of them had information about what they were doing to measure how they were doing in diversity. So that is a way that an organization can really show that they have a commitment, right? And if it's in their overall organizational reporting, again, that shows that they have a commitment. But there's a lot of different initiatives that they may have in their organization that they can share on their website that shows that they have a commitment to diversity. Like employee resource groups, like mentoring programs, like community involvement with different diverse communities. There's a number of ways, and it's an important question, Stephen, because there is a lot of evidence that shows that this is becoming a decision-making factor for a lot of people, especially younger people. There's a lot of research that shows that it is part of the decision-making process for millennials on where they're going to work, and they actually check out organizations quite thoroughly in many different ways. And we know that there are websites that can share negative information about you, so you might want to be aware of what's being shared on those as well. Thanks for the question. Cyndy, do you have anything to add?
No, I would echo that completely. We've recently launched a new onboarding site and spent a lot of time and attention to ensure that prospective employees could very easily see our commitment to diversity and would have access to some of the communications and the different things and the different awards that we have won in this space.
That's great, yes. Definitely getting external recognition is an important piece of it as well.
That's great.
Okay, so there is another question. It is, what strategies can be used to help senior leaders understand the value of formalizing a diversity strategy when there isn't a real burning platform, as in the company feels naturally diverse and they don't need policies or programs to make it happen?
Thank you for the question. It's a great question. I would say the first step is creating a diversity business case. So, really clearly articulating what is the business case for your particular organization. So we talked about a lot of the impacts, bottom line impacts of diversity. What you need to do is go through the process of articulating how all those impacts are addressed specifically in your organization and how diversity impacts those things, and that you can show, directly to your leaders increased revenues or decreased costs. Anytime you can talk to them about saving money or making more money, that's definitely going to make the case for them. Certainly one of the things that we've often done with a number of organizations that we work with is what we call a leadership boot camp. So it's kind of a really targeted session for senior leaders to explain to them the importance of diversity and inclusion for their organization. And often we work with the organization in advance of that to identify exactly what is the business case for that organization to help the leaders understand. I would say every organization should be focusing on diversity, and we do hear that quite a lot, that, our organization is already diverse, we don't really need to focus on this. Certainly there are improvements and there are impacts for any organization to pay more attention to diversity. Thanks for the question.
Okay, I think we should take maybe one more question.
Great.
So this one is, does an organization report on all the aspects of the GRI that you listed, or just the ones that most apply to them?
I have seen corporate social responsibility reports where an organization does not report on everything. Is that what your experience too, Stephen?
Well, that's true of all the indicators.
Yeah.
It is largely voluntary, and how many you report on indicates how many what score you'll receive. So the more indicators you respond to adequately, the higher the score you receive. That's, Steph, you're a GRI certified. You've been trained on this, but that's my understanding is that you can kind of pick and choose which ones you want to respond to.
Mm-hmm. And from what I understand, the guideline is that you should be reporting on the ones that are material to your operations.
Yes.
I think that it was interesting. The G3 had core and optional indicators, and the G4 did away with that. So there is no sort of optional indicators on the G4, which I thought was interesting, because some of the diversity indicators were considered additional or optional on the G3. But certainly, it's a guideline. It is voluntary in most jurisdictions. But I think seeing that there's this, very well-respected body that's created standards on what you should be reporting on as an organization, and they say that these things should be included, I think that's a good indication that they're important. But yeah, people are not necessarily reporting on all of them. So thanks for that question.
Did we want to open up the phones to see if there's anybody that online that can?
I think due to the time,
Yeah, we're getting
just
done.
wrap things up. But if anyone has any questions, feel free to email us, and we'll get back to you.
Oh, okay.
And same with all the questions that haven't been answered, we'll follow up in the package.
That's great.
Yes, thank you for everyone for being on the line today and for the questions. We do appreciate the questions.
Thanks to you, Cyndy, as well. Appreciate you dialing in from Halifax today and sharing your experience from Bell Aliant. And thanks to all of the participants. Again, we had a really tremendous response to this webinar, and a really high percentage of you followed through with joining us today. So thank you for that. And check CBSR.ca for future events. Our next webinar session will actually be on human rights in the extractive sector, partnering with the NODO Human Rights and former associate Stephanie Garrett. So we'll be looking at that, and I can see some ties, especially related to the environment component that is the lesser thought of CSR pillar that connects with diversity and inclusion, and that symbiotic relationship with Indigenous cultures that they have with the environment. So I think this is going to be an interesting 1-2 punch.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good afternoon, and we'll see you on the next webinar.
Thank you.